everybody to the first of what we hope to be a series of webinars from the Regional Economic Development Institute in response to the COVID pandemic and what it is influence it's having on different parts of Colorado's economy and communities. I'm Dawn Thilmany, one of your hosts for today, and I'll be introducing both our topic and our speakers for today. So in addition to those of us who are on the Regional Economic Development Institute team that decided to put these webinars together, Dr. Stefan Weiler, who you'll hear from shortly, Dr. Becky Hill, who will be speaking with me today, and Jennifer Ponscore, who will be hosting our Q&A with our visitors. We also were lucky to have two very busy people, Michael O'Connell and Jacob Castillo, join us to talk about how some of these issues are playing out in our communities this very week. So to give you a little bit more context, we are hosting this series of events to kind of connect some of our applied research on campus to the broader engagement mission of Colorado State University. And so with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Stefan Weiler, who will tell you a little bit more about the Regional Economic Development Institute that's hosting these particular events.
Thanks very much, Dawn. As Dawn mentioned, I'm the co-director of the Regional Economic Development Institute, and I'm also a professor of economics at CSU, and have been in Colorado now for the last 25 years and studying it along with the rest of our team. We are pleased to be able to have as partners the CSU Engagement Office. This is our website, redi.colostate.edu. You can take a look on our homepage. We got originally known for noting that rural areas are surprisingly entrepreneurial. But in general, our aim on the next slide is to focus on engaged and be seriously engaged in the state on research-driven analyses, informing industry, policy, and communities on economic development perspectives in Colorado, with a particular focus on shared challenges and opportunities to connect rural and urban places, which we think is an untapped resource. We engage with public, private, and nonprofit partners to promote sustainable regional economic development by providing apolitical, scholarly, and actionable research and policy perspectives. So what these webinars are, this is the first of a series of at least three. We hope to showcase some of the most relevant research and resources to help the state and its communities cope with the economic crisis born from COVID-19. So we've been thinking about small business a lot for quite a while and at REDI. And the reason why is that thriving regions grow largely through small businesses. And as it turns out, most people don't realize that young, small companies, basically smaller than 10 people, aged less than 5 years, generate the majority of job growth in the United States. So it's not the big guys, the IBMs, the Apples, the Googles, that generate most of the job growth. It's the little folks. But these businesses have an uphill climb in a lot of areas. Being a small business, they don't necessarily have all the resources to take most advantage of the opportunities because it requires really full information, not just data. So for example, if you take a look at the graphic here, this is U.S. establishment entry and exit over the last 20 years. And most people would focus on the bottom dotted line, which is the net entry rate, which looks over the last few years like it's been going up, which seems to be a good thing that we have on net establishments and businesses gaining ground. But what you'll notice in general is that since the Great Recession, that entries in green and exits in red, those have been going down. That's what we call a decrease in dynamism, that there's less and less dynamic entrepreneurship going on, that there's less and less activity going on. And we are concerned about that because dynamism really matters in terms of jobs and workforce options. So having all that information, there's a lot of data out there, but turning it into information is difficult, and it's unlikely in many economic development contexts. Urban markets in general have more dynamic entrepreneurial systems, but it turns out that this crisis, as is shown, ground zero is unfortunately New York City again. Both rural and urban markets are going to be different going forward. There's going to be a new normal out there. And so successful economies in the new age and the new normal will now need even more information than they did before. So dynamic entrepreneurship is valuable. This is basically our mission, is to turn data into information for economic development. So data informing economic development. And our research is showing that dynamic entrepreneurship, the number of entries and exits, the number of openings and closures is valuable. Younger firms tend to be more productive and more innovative. They tend to create more job options, and it allows people to move into younger, nimbler firms. And in general, what it shows is that places that have more openings and yes, more closures tend to have stronger job growth over the long term. Why? Because it turns out that business productivity depends a lot on information itself. Things like market demand, knowing what your market is and knowing what the demand is going to be and how it's going to change. And obviously market demand is changing even as we speak. It's a question of availability of inputs. Are you going to have the right workers? Are you going to have the right set of land? Are you going to have the right suppliers? That, of course, has become a big issue with COVID-19 as well. So where does this information come from? Well, it comes from actually businesses themselves. It comes through the successes and failures of other entrepreneurial ventures. So in fact, as our guest will tell you, what doesn't work is as important as what does work. It requires tolerance of failures. And yes, there are a lot of business failures right now, but we need to have an understanding about why they failed, especially the recent ones, because it's a particular crisis that we're undergoing. I grew up in California in the Bay Area in the 70s and 80s. And when I came to Colorado 25 years ago, it reminded me a lot of California, of the Bay Area, of Silicon Valley during that time and during its growth period. And that's what's exciting about it, but it's also a challenge. And so what we've been trying to do is turn data into information that can clarify the potential ways forward. So what further area of interest of ours, as we said, is a lot of people do work on urban areas. We're one of the few research institutes that actually looks also at rural areas. And rural areas are still pioneers in a surprising sense. Rural communities are actually remarkably entrepreneurial. And that tends to surprise people in cities and along the Front Range. The tech startups are not the norm. In fact, small business ventures, non-employers, for instance, the gig economy, which we'll talk about in a little while, all of those are actually much bigger players. And they're more bigger players in rural communities. And because they have to be entrepreneurial. It's not like you have a big Google or Intel factory where employers exist and you can pick up a job. No, wage and salary employers are rare in rural areas. And towns and residents, nevertheless, have figured out a way to find their own niche, to be entrepreneurial, to start their own businesses, and eventually even hire employees. And what's even more remarkable, especially in this particular setting, is that rural businesses are more resilient. We looked at 5-year survival rates, which is kind of the gold standard in terms of survival over the Great Recession. As it turns out, rural areas were much more resilient in terms of surviving through the Great Recession than their urban cousins. And again, so rural areas are again surprising and better surviving disruptors like the ones we have right now. So one of our goals really is to have Colorado become a leader in bridging the rural-urban divide. And bridging the rural-urban divide is something that has gotten a lot of attention, particularly since the last election. And what you'll see is on the graphics on the right-hand side is that the warm spots, basically, in orange and red, were much more spread out in the economy. What you'll notice in the 2000s, in the 2010s with projections towards 2020, you'll notice that the growth is becoming much more concentrated along the Front Range. And we know that, and what it has led to though is with that growth has come real infrastructure problems. We all know the parking lot that is I-25, and that is something that didn't exist 25 years ago, but now with the growth that we've had along the Front Range, I-25 and other infrastructure has gotten really hammered. And cost pressures, it's becoming really expensive. It's hard for young families to afford a home in these places along the Front Range. Meanwhile, you have exactly the opposite problem in rural areas. Rural areas don't have infrastructural problems. The roads are clear. In many cases, the broadband is available, and housing costs are quite reasonable, but they don't have the growth that they need. So what we're trying to do is think about a way of bridging the gap, of creating a win-win, both for urban areas and rural areas. So leveraging urban dynamism, that dynamic entrepreneurial culture, and as well as harnessing that rural entrepreneurial culture that we just talked about. What the fancy term for it is what's called location neutral entrepreneurship. And that basically means that you can set up pretty much wherever you want as long as you have a good IT connection and information technology connection. So if we can channel some of the Front Range growth to rural Colorado, that would reduce some of the cost pressures and the freeway pressures on I-25 and other such infrastructure, and increase rural dynamism. Again, it doesn't take much in rural communities. Only 1 or 2 or 3 entrepreneurs can make a real difference in small towns. And so thinking regionally, thinking about the whole state as opposed to just locally can help lift all boats. It's a win for rural areas, it's a win for urban areas, and that's the theme that we've been trying to work on at REDI since our inception. So REDI focuses on informing these potential linkages on these potential linkages. And so again, to create win-win. So research areas that we focus on are rural-urban divides, bridges and economic development, also food systems and agriculture, which will be the topic next week, entrepreneurship, innovation, livable communities, and Poverty Action Center at REDI, which is looking at developing countries. So if you want more information on us, if you just pick up our website at just redi.colostate.edu. We have a special sub-site for the COVID-19 responses. And to learn more about our team, you can go to the bios and contact page. But the core site, redi.colostate.edu, can give you all of these resources. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it over now to Don and to Don Thilmany and Rebecca Hill for talking about the on-demand gig economy.
Thank you, Stefan. And just to remind folks, we'll make these slides available with the link we'll send after the webinar and post at that site. So don't worry about scribbling down some of these detailed links if we're going too fast. Again, this is Don Thilmany, and we wanted to share before we get to the part of the program where we talk about some of the resource programs coming out right now, what we do know about the gig economy. This is a link I made for Google searches that have happened, and there's 2 things I want to draw your attention to. First is the red line, which is gig workers, which is another term for on-demand workers, and what the trends has been for those over the last month or so. And in addition to the trend spiking up, perhaps because people were either trying to learn if there were gig opportunities or how gig workers were going to be supported in this CARES Act. It has been substantial over the last month. And if you look at a map of where that activity has been the highest, our state is bright red. That means we have a lot of people very interested in that topic. In addition, of course, we saw the Payroll Protection Act, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit, an interest in that spike about the time that it passed a couple of weeks ago. So those are 2 of the topics we're going to actually intersect our discussion on the rest of today. What we first want to point out, and really is a foreshadowing to what we're going to share with you, is that COVID is very likely differentially impacting small business and entrepreneurs, not just for the reasons that Stefan's already pointed out, but for the fact that we learned in our project, which we did with the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment, actually as part of a National Governors Association initiative, that entrepreneurs come in many different shapes and styles. You draw your eyes to the upper left-hand corner. We have those Main Street entrepreneurs who are keeping the retail stores, restaurants, and arts events happening in even the smallest of towns throughout our community. We have the ones people more typically think of in the top right, who are those innovators who are bringing high tech and new age, new science solutions to their communities. We have the people in the bottom right corner, the micro enterprises, who are people who decided they want to work for themselves, either in the creative arts, the professional services, or a wider range of services. And then we have people even who are doing this as a second stage for after their first career is kind of wrapped up. The reason this is important to note is because then if you start thinking about how this event is hitting these people, it's going to be quite different, and it probably means that the types of questions we're going to be asked might be different from those folks. It surprise you to know that according to a few reports, about 25 to 30% of Americans engage somehow with the on-demand economy. And that last slide showed you again how diverse that was, so you might not have even thought of yourself as being an on-demand economy and are. If the Bureau of Labor Statistics gives you their very narrow definition of it, they at least say at least 14% of us are some form of on-demand economy. And then of course the online platform economy, which we're hearing a lot about, is a smaller set of that, but the fastest growing part of that. And this report was of course done before COVID. And as we've all been noting, there's been a significant increase in online activity So that's only going to get more significant. And again, is a particular set of the population we want to think about. I don't intend for you to capture the whole story here from this graphic, but it is from one of the reports that REDI has put out. It's mostly to show you again by the size of the bubble and where it is on this graphic that we see entrepreneurship, which is kind of formally defined as non-employer establishments. They're out there doing their own thing and filing taxes, perhaps as an entity, but not really setting up a shop with employees showing up. And you can see from the names on these bubbles that they're really across all sectors of the economy. So this is not at all a monolithic thing. It's a very diverse set of people we're talking about when we talk about small businesses and entrepreneurs. There does seem to be a link between non-employer activity and future changes in employer establishments. So kind of what, as Stefan alluded to, what you really want to see as a pathway for at least some of these entrepreneurs is they are trying out or piloting a new venture. But if it is successful and they find the right pathway, they may grow into being homegrown businesses and industries that a lot of our communities would like to see grow. And so, in fact, we see about a third of the new job growth in the US comes from those small startup establishments. And we think that's very much why this particular CARES package really targeted to make sure small businesses were well taken care of in this COVID response. Self-employment also tends to increase more quickly than wage and salary jobs. And we can't imagine as we start seeing a pathway to recovery from the events that are happening right now, that might be true as well. It might be those small businesses that have to pull us out of this economic event, because some of the big companies are going to be feeling the pain of their inability to be as nimble for quite a while. So again, we aren't going to cover it all today, but we did do a project with the Colorado Department of Labor, and it's posted up at the website that Stefan announced, looking at exactly what's going on with the Colorado on-demand economy. And just a couple themes that came out from that we were at least surprised by. A lot of those participants had multiple jobs. And again, why that's interesting right now is because perhaps one of the workplaces that a gig worker was associated with has closed down, but another one has had increased activity. For instance, we did see some delivery drivers within our subset, and we know they are only busier than they've ever been. We saw a combination of push and pull pathways. That's our way of saying sometimes people think the only reason anyone would take a gig job or an on-demand job is they were pushed into it because they didn't have any other alternatives or other places they really could contribute to the economy. But just as often we saw some pull pathways where people saw such a great opportunity or a place to contribute to the economy, they were pulled into it by seeing that the market was strong in a space that wasn't quite yet filled. We did see some concerns from these workers, though, and particularly that they felt that they lacked a formal support system. Lack of benefits was one example of that, but even just someone to get questions answered. So again, this is part of why we're doing this webinar today and why we have our visitors here is, some of them maybe had not connected with all the government agencies that could support them yet. So it might be our jobs as connectors in our communities to make sure they find them. And what really we found most surprising is that everybody thinks the on-demand economy is perhaps a sector people are trying to escape from and land or secure that permanent job. In fact, we had the majority of our participants tell us they were exactly where they wanted to be. They wanted to be independent. They wanted to be working more nimbly across several jobs and being their own boss. And so we have to remember that too as we think about how they'll help the economy recover. So again, just to remind you, this is another way to slice and dice how you might see on-demand workers categorized, but there's very different small businesses and entrepreneurs out there. They're all going to be impacted by this event very differently and might have different questions for us as leaders in our community, and we should be thinking in a slightly nuanced way about how we would support them and how the programs that are rolling out from the government might best set them up to help us recover from this event. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Becky Hill to talk a little bit about the highlights of a couple of the programs, and then of course we'll turn to our speakers who can answer your questions.
Great, thank you, Dawn. So I'm going to put a little grounding in some of these. You've heard about the CARES Act, the EIDL, the PPP. So I'm going to put a little bit of grounding there and kind of talk about these and start out talking about the CARES Act and how it relates to this new economy or 1099 gig contract workers. So as part of this CARES Act, they changed some of the unemployment insurance rules, and they extended this unemployment insurance to include these gig workers, these contract workers, and these self-employed workers that otherwise before this did not qualify for unemployment. And so this unemployment is available for up to 39 weeks. And when they apply for it, it's retroactive to the first week of February. As many of you have probably heard, the CARES Act also gave an additional $600 weekly on top of the existing benefits. And this is retroactive back to March 29th. And currently they think this additional $600 is going to run through the end of July, but that might change. So the two main things that you've heard of probably is the EIDL and then the PPP. And so first I'm going to talk about the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Grant. This is that $10,000 grant, and it's based now, we've learned, on the number of employees. So they keep saying you can get a max of 10,000. We've gotten some clarity that now that 10,000 is $1,000 per employee to a max of $10,000. And these funds are going to be released soon, and they're starting to develop some different tracking platforms and things that people can go on and look at where they are in line and kind of where they are for getting this loan grant. In addition to this loan grant, so you can apply for the EIDL loan grant, and in addition, you can get a loan of up to $15,000. When they first talked about this loan, they had said it was going to be up to $2 million, but they've had so much demand for it that they have decreased that limit to up to $15,000. And these current appropriations allow the SBA to make initial loan disbursements for 2 months of working capital up to that max of $15,000. And it's important to know that this is in addition to that $10,000 grant that I talked about in the last slide. The other program is the PPP, or the Payroll Protection Program. And it's important to note that you can do one or the other. So you're either doing the EIDL or you're doing the PPP. And so this is kind of just a look at the application page for that PPP program. And basically what we're hearing with, and I'd love to hear what Jacob and Mike have to say about this, but we've heard that businesses are starting to receive approval from their banks, but we haven't heard of many that have actually received funds yet. The clients that we've heard about that tend to have the most success in receiving these funds are working with some of those more local and regional banks, but we're hopeful that many are going to start receiving funds in the next few weeks for this payroll protection program. And so the PPP offers loans of up to $10 million at a 1% interest rate. And these loans mature in 2 years, but you're also getting some grant or some of this loan forgiven. The amount of the loan that's used for payroll during the first 8 weeks of this loan could be forgiven as long as certain requirements are met, including that a minimum of 75% of this loan that you receive must be used for payroll. Here's a good resource for additional information on this payroll protection program. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jen Ponce-Pore, who is a workforce specialist and the director of the Colorado State University Engagement Hubs, to introduce our two special guests.
Thank you, Becky. We're going to shift gears now and hear from our guests, a couple of good friends and colleagues joining us today. First, we have Mike O'Connell. He is the director of the Larimer County SBDC, the Small Business Development Center. But what's interesting is from 2001 to 2012, Mike operated Mountain Woods Furniture, which is a leading national designer and manufacturer of rustic handcrafted furniture. And he sold that business in 2012. His products were sold through Cabela's and natural furniture retailers, furniture stores, and resorts and lodges liking that rustic style. He provided over 6,000 paychecks to American manufacturing workers during his ownership of that company. He has a business degree with a marketing emphasis from Purdue, and he became the Larimer County SBDC director in 2013. And by 2016, the center was one of the top performing sites in the state. He also serves on the Larimer County Workforce Development Board, which deals with local workforce opportunities and issues, and the Northern Colorado Better Business Bureau Board. He's also a professional musician and plays classic 70s and 80s music with venues in Northern Colorado, and he has 3 kids. Mike, thank you for taking the time to join us during this really busy time for the SBDC.
Thank you, Jennifer.
We're going to start with some questions, and then we'll have a Q&A at the very end for everyone to ask questions. So, Mike, can you share with us, based on your observations and what you're seeing on the ground, how has COVID impacted small businesses and gig workers from what you see? What changes have you seen?
Well, it's had a big impact, particularly for those businesses who are customer-facing, restaurants, stores, where they've had to operate under a closure. There's a lot of businesses out there that the financial reserves are pretty thin. They operate on low margins, and when you're being told to take a hit for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, you're going to have zero revenue. That takes some extraordinary financial resources to survive. It has really pointed up to me the importance of having a credible relationship, because Rebecca did a really nice job covering the PPP program, but the banks make the ultimate decision whether they want to extend those loans. So having a banking relationship is giving these businesses a source of short-term cash that's really important. And back to your question, even the businesses that say sell to a restaurant, they're impacted, and it certainly has impacted the employees. I mean, think of how much we have mutually worked on workforce and building teams and trying to retain key people, and then boom, now you're forced with letting them go. So that is a brutal process to go through.
Do you remember 2010? You might have been in business at that time, but can you speak to how this time compares to the recession? Do you have a perspective on that?
I do have a perspective, unfortunately. I was running Mountain Woods Furniture when the Great Recession hit in 2009, 2010. And as I remember, that was largely caused by the retail meltdown, the consumer housing meltdown. And a lot of our furniture went into second homes. So picture the economic dynamic where people are having a problem paying the mortgage on their first home, and we're trying to sell furniture into a second home. And I know a lot of my competitors and peers went out of business. The one thing that we did have going for us, I'd like to say it was part of a strategic plan, but I'd probably call it more dumb luck than anything, was that we had a pretty strong presence in the commercial and hospitality marketplaces, and those were still going pretty strong. They weren't impacted by the consumer housing bubble. So we were fortunate to get some pretty large projects that kept us afloat, really avoided us having to lay off all but a very small number of employees, and that was a big difference for us. And in fact, one of the things we're doing now to that end is we're looking at alternate revenue that customers can do. Can you move some of your stuff onto e-commerce processes? I'm amazed how creative some of the restaurants in Northern Colorado have been with takeout and pickup and waivers to serve drinks that you can take out. And it's been amazing what they're doing to find a way to generate some revenue, because that's really critical.
That is a difference. We have a much more mature internet infrastructure now.
Yep.
That I think people are leveraging to try and find new ways to stay afloat. I can totally see that. Did you have anything that you wanted to expand on in the programs that Becky had talked about? Was there anything that you wanted to add or comment on there?
Yeah, and Rebecca did a really nice job of covering those programs. They're the same ones we're talking about to customers. And for those of you that may not know, what we do at the Small Business Development Center is we do street smart business education and connection to resources. And we do that primarily by free one-on-one consulting. We get about 25% of our funding from the SBA. All of the SBDC centers around the country, of which there's about 1,000, are partially funded by the SBA. And they want us to do free consulting. So we consulted last year with about 1,000 clients. Roughly half of them were existing businesses that need help with one particular phase or aspect of their business. And the other half were entrepreneurs. They're looking to start something. One of our flagship classes is Essential Steps to Starting Your Business, that kind of helps people understand what they don't know, what they need to know, key parts that you want to focus on to get this thing started, a lot of which has to do with making sure that you're going to have customers that are interested in your product. So we also run about 100 classes a year. We're doing some of those right now virtually. They're all being done virtually because of COVID. And we're doing consulting now all virtually too. We've got about 15 consultants that are pretty highly trained on the PPP loans, on the SBA EIDL loans. And jumping back to my furniture days for a moment, I applied for and got an EIDL loan. I was running the furniture business, and some wildfires went through southern Colorado and northern Arizona. They shut down a bunch of my dealers / customers, and that hurt my sales revenue. So I was able to apply for an EIDL loan. I got $40,000 at a time when I really needed that, and I was fortunately able to pay that back 2 or 3 years later. So that was a short-term part of getting cash that was pretty helpful for me.
That's good to know that that loan worked then too. So it does help.
Is it okay if I ask one question?
Of course.
I kept forgetting I wanted to even bring this up, but we've heard a lot of mixed messages about whether agricultural operations qualify for the different types of assistance you just mentioned, Mike.
Right.
There's been really mixed messages about that. Can you clarify? Because again, given we have extension agents all across the state, and a lot of them are in rural areas where ag is a big driver, that's been curious to a lot of people.
I'm going to have to say that I will find out. I don't know the answer to that. I do believe I saw something that the USDA had a program out there, and their own grant or loan program for ag operations. I was also involved with the Estes Park flood recovery about 5 years ago, and I do remember that agricultural entities were not eligible for this. They had their own programs that were going through agriculture. So my initial reaction is I don't think so, but I will find out.
Thank you. And we can post that information, Mike, when we're done. So everyone is experiencing information overload, like small businesses, and like you said, things are changing so quickly. Can you point us to maybe 1 or 2 of the top sites to get accurate, timely information on what's happening for small business?
Yes, I certainly can. We have a website on here at our center in northern Colorado. It is www.larimer, L-A-R-I-M-E-R, larimersbdc.org. And I wouldn't look at the whole website, but I would look at the COVID-19 tab. It's in the upper right. And I would also say that probably what is a better site is the statewide SBDC site, which is www.coloradosbdc. I'm going to put it up on the chat here in a moment, but I believe that's coloradosbdc.org. But that will connect anyone outside of NOCO to the 15 SBDC centers that we've got around the state, plus our lead center. And that's going to be a very useful resource for anyone in Colorado. So that's the primary one that I would look at. And I'm also going to give a shout out to the Larimer County Workforce and Economic Development Center, because they've got some probably the best source for unemployment unemployment insurance, because there's a lot of unclear information about whether you're better off to take PPP or whether you're better off to take unemployment. So.
Right. I think that's a tricky question, and that's a great way for people to navigate that news. So wrapping up, for business owners out there, small businesses, you've been a business owner, you see kind of what they're going to be going through. It's going to be a while before we get back to normal, if we ever do. Do you have any advice or last thoughts you'd like to share with small businesses and communities out there?
Yes, I think it's so this crisis, to me, it's really pointed up the importance of having a relationship with a lender or a bank. you know, I used to meet my banker for a coffee every 3 months just to make sure he knew what was going on with the business, understood the importance of that, because it's really tough right now for people to go in cold to these bankers who are absolutely overwhelmed and try to form a relationship to get that that financing going. So a source of funding is always important. I think going forward, I'm kind of looking at what we're going to expect to see coming out of this, and I think you're going to see some businesses that have been only slightly impacted. Maybe it's construction, maybe it's manufacturing, some manufacturing. They'll continue to get the traditional SBDC assistance. I think you're going to find others that have been significantly impacted, particularly as far as taking on more debt. And we're going to try to have financial resources to help those businesses, help them with you know, operational optimization. And I think you're going to have other businesses that you're going to have more startups, you're going to have more people looking to try to sell their business. So I think the buy-sell activity is going to go up, and you're going to have some business failures too, unfortunately. I think that's going to be a spike, and I think that's going to be inevitable, unfortunately. But depending on how that occurs, that also creates opportunities to start new entities.
You know, it's good to hear that some businesses may get stronger through this, and I think that that's true. So we'll keep our ear to the ground on that. Mike, thank you very much. Can you stick around for some questions at the end?
Absolutely.
Thanks very much. So next we have Jacob Castillo, and his line there is just Jacob. Yes, he's in his car. Poor guy has got a couple of young kids in the house, so he's joined us from his car. We're really grateful that he was able to make the time. Jacob serves as the director of the Larimer County Economic and Workforce Development Department. It's one of the rare departments in Colorado that blends economic and workforce development, so it's a great connection. He has a background in regional economic development, and his past entrepreneurial successes include an international clean technology product distribution company and a leading-edge bicycle manufacturing firm, both of which have strong social and environmental focus. He was a contributing author to a textbook on sustainable venturing and has served as an instructor at Colorado State University. He holds 3 undergraduate degrees in agricultural business, foreign language and literature, and economics from CSU, and pursued a double master's in global, social, and sustainable enterprise and agricultural and resource economics. Jacob, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks, Jen. You know, it's funny as you're reading the bio, which is always a bit embarrassing, as you know, kind of everyone on these calls knows. And I'm sitting in my car on this webinar trying to deliver some information. So I appreciate everybody's patience during these interesting times. Jen mentioned earlier, I have a 14-month-old who is cranky before a nap and a 5-year-old who is throwing a fit because she wanted to watch TV instead of do schoolwork. And of course, because we're schooling from home right now, you know, we're just trying to figure it all out. So that's my current situation, but I am very happy to be here. It actually gives me a nice break from what's going on inside the house.
Maybe you'll take a nap when you're done. Well, no, we appreciate you being here. And actually, your situation speaks very well to the turbulence that I think we're experiencing in our workaday world. So thank you for joining us. So Jacob, I heard on a conference call last week, CDLE said that they usually get about 1,000 calls a day. And on March 20th, they had 245,000 call attempts. So I can imagine that the workforce system, and it's not all unemployment insurance, but I think the workforce system is certainly feeling the shift. Can you share with us from your perspective and where you sit how COVID has impacted employers and the workforce?
Well, let's start with kind of the workforce and where we're seeing some of those major impacts. I mean, it's somewhat laughable that I'm doing this webinar from my car because I have, you know, some kids throwing fits inside. But the reality is for thousands, tens of thousands of Coloradoans, I mean, they're in the same boat. They're not able to go into their office. They may not have a car to go to work remotely. And quite frankly, this is a very challenging time for people who are still actually working. For those who are not, which we're seeing at unprecedented numbers, the situation is very tenuous and very stressful. The spike in unemployment claims, which you've already alluded to, is very real. When this first started, there was a panic that seemed to have set in where people were losing their jobs by the hundreds,
right.
And our system was overwhelmed. It feels like that is dissipated just a bit, that it's not this real panic sensation, But people are looking at what they're going to be doing next, and they're figuring out how to navigate the unemployment insurance process. They're thinking about updating their resume. What is the next job if they're not able to go back to their former occupation? So we will see a massive increase in use of our services for the workforce.
Yes.
On the business side of things, and Mike has mentioned this, I mean, there's not an employer or a business who hasn't been impacted by COVID-19.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, at the very early days when we were first trying to understand what was happening and gauge the impact, our regional ecosystem, and we're very fortunate, we work in an environment where city economic development, county economic development, other organizations and institutions like the SBDCs and the Chambers of Commerce were able to deploy a survey very quickly to our business community to understand what was going on in their world. And the vast majority of these are 1 to 9 employee firms. And we had already seen by the end of, I think it was last week, nearly 30% had laid off employees, 41% had reduced hours. Again, nearly 30% had laid off more than half of their staff. So we're talking huge numbers that we've not really seen before. Mike already said that the businesses need cash now, and it's not because they're not running profitable businesses. It's because the way cash flow works for many of these operations, especially in retail, food service, and hospitality, cash flow is king, and you've got to have money coming in the door. And that spigot just turned off very suddenly, as everyone's very well of. So we kind of have two sides of the same coin, where businesses are impacted, workers are impacted, and just to be quite frank, our system is somewhat overwhelmed. When I say our system, I'm generally referring to the unemployment insurance system, but we'll see more strain on all of our systems, from human services, food assistance, all the way through our workforce programs and retraining.
And I remember during the last recession, there was a huge push for people doing career shifts and upskilling and retraining and going back to community colleges. Does the workforce system provide resources for people trying to upskill?
We do. We've seen diminishing resources in that space for a number of years, but I think there will be, my read of the tea leaves is that we'll see some emergency funds come down from the feds and the state to help people retool into critical occupations or train up in jobs that are more abundant post this pandemic. Now that's a prognostication on my part. I don't have any evidence to say that we're going to get more money. But if the recession is any indicator, or our last recession was any indicator of what will happen, we'll see more money flow into the workforce system. So I would expect some increased demand for courses at CSU, especially online. I could see our community colleges flooded with requests for customized training from employers, and then also demand for industry recognized certificates and credentials and some degrees.
Okay. And can you expand a little? Do you have anything you'd like to add to the information that Becky had talked about, like the Paycheck Protection Program, or is there anything you'd like to add? I just wanted to give you the opportunity if you wanted to say anything about that.
I think Rebecca covered it really well. There are two websites I'd like to point people to that I think can be very helpful resources. The first is our department website, and that's larimer.org/EWD. That stands for Economic and Workforce Development. So larimer.org/EWD. And then a really solid business resource is nocorecovers.com. And this is something that we stood up very quickly in our region. It's a coordinated and collaborative effort between municipal, regional economic developers, the SBDCs, and the chambers of commerce to make sure businesses have a single point of entry for resources that then can get them to the right places where there's answers to their varied questions.
You know, I've heard from other communities that that is key, is a collaborative attempt, is that you bring together all the agencies to come up with a combined solution, and don't worry about staying in your silos, but try and have that community conversation about how we can solve this together.
Jen, one of the things that I think, if I could just say something real quick, that Northern Colorado had in place prior to the pandemic that was a huge boon for us was that our business serving community, so like the Small Business Development Center or workforce programs, the chambers and economic developers, had established trust with one another, had a history and track record of working together. And when it came time to form teams and get work done very quickly, we already had those relationships and the infrastructure to do it. And I can tell you, not every place in Colorado has that, and not every place in the country has it, but it did allow us to move much more swiftly to serve our business community and those affected job seekers and workers.
Yes, thank you for that. I think that's an excellent point. So last question. They're saying that the recovery may take a while and that we may not be able to get back to work. We need to have widespread testing. We need to have a vaccine. This may be a while. Looking out over the horizon, what advice or any last thoughts would you like to share with employers or employees looking at sort of the long game?
Jen, I think you're exactly right. Even if things, even if we have a stay-at-home order lifted in the next 30 to 60 days, I think we're looking at 18 to 24 months of really abnormal business activity. You're going to be seeing masks and protective equipment in the workplace. You're going to be seeing it in retail firms, food service firms. So things will not be normal for quote unquote normal for quite some time. I think businesses need to start, if they haven't already, start preparing for kind of the next stage of our economy. And it's very difficult to say that, not knowing exactly what that is. But spending habits will likely change. Traffic patterns will likely change. Even consumers are looking at how they spend their money differently. And I don't know if once things kind of settle, if we're going to go back to the same patterns and habits that we had prior to the pandemic.
Well, thank you, Jacob, for that. And Mike, thank you for your comments. I'm going to turn this back over to Dawn as people have been chatting with some questions, and go ahead and turn it over to her to moderate the Q&A, and we'll wrap up. Thank you both for being here. It's a big help. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks. Well, just as I expected, we have people who are curious about many things, and Mike actually started answering some of the questions in the chat box, but I'm going to try to grab a couple of the big themes. One is that there was questions about you guys, of course, featured what's going on in Northern Colorado, but we have participants from all over the state. But they're just to clarify, so are offices across the state equipped that if someone really needs very attentive direction about how to get through a payment protection program submission, someone either by phone or online can actually help walk them through that process?
The answer is yes. That's what we do with the SBDC. The first thing that we're trying to help the client get their arms around is help them with how much money do you need. I mean, many clients don't know that, but they know there's this rush. They've seen all the emails, huge pressure to do something. But we're sitting down saying, okay, you've already talked to your bank, or you should be, about what kind of deferral programs do they have? What kind of help can they give me? You should have had a discussion with your landlord, if you have one, about your rent. You've looked at what you're going to do with people. You've gone through all your operating expenses, selling, general administrative expenses, and you've looked and said, boy, this is what I need on a monthly basis. And now if you multiply that times 3, that's probably a rough back of the envelope number that you're going to need to raise money with. So from there, we say, okay, how can we patch together some things? Maybe something with your current bank. Maybe they have a line of credit. You know, and we do have clients that haven't proactively talk to their current bank, which is one of the first things we're going to do. So we're kind of walking them through that process. We're talking about other source of funds, whether it's Colorado microlenders, which lend money to traditionally non-bankable folks. Might be a veteran-owned business, might be a woman-owned business. So that's a pretty key part of what we do.
Great. Now here's one that's a bit more specific from Karen up in the northeast corner. I guess there's been some clarification that sporting goods stores that carry guns are allowed to be open, whereas more mainline retailers aren't. Are you hearing of places that this is causing tension with people who feel like they're classified as essential versus not, and how it might unintentionally affect the competitiveness of firms who have different product offerings?
Jacob, I'm probably going to defer that one to you because I think that's a county by county definition, is it not?
Yeah, Mike, thanks. I think there are some specifics coming down from the governor's office, but the local public health director, I believe, has authority over what businesses are deemed essential and not. And yes, I think the answer to the question is that there are businesses that feel like they should be open right now. There's also businesses that I think would rather be closed. So we've seen kind of a mixed bag, and it will affect people's competitiveness in this environment. But it's up to the local public health director as to what businesses are deemed essential, and we have seen some businesses kind of skirt the rules and stay open during these times. I know very early on there was a gym, it was open during the cover of night, so people were going and working out, midnight to 2 a.m. and they had to get shut down. So I know businesses are trying to find their ways around the rules to stay open, but the bottom line is it's a county by county designation, and there are some businesses who are reaping the benefits of being open, while others are feeling the pain of having to shut their doors when they'd rather be open to the public.
It's interesting to note, I didn't realize some of the decisions were at quite that municipal or county level scale. So that's important for a lot of people to know, because a lot of our partners, particularly in Extension, have relationships where they can check on that locally then. Another question from Greg is, it's kind of, as you noted, the crisis has exposed the importance of having a strong banking relationship through the crisis. He's had a couple discussions though, where it sounds like the lenders are saying that you have to have a deposit and lending relationship with the bank to actually have access to these programs.
Right.
And given the diversity of small business types we've talked about in this presentation, they may not be set up as well as a bigger business or a longer term business to have that extensive of a relationship. Do you have any words of wisdom for people about how to help small businesses in that situation navigate that challenge?
I do, and then I'm also going to point out the positive of that, which will be you probably need less money to survive. Your break even's a lot lower, which is good, certainly in times like this. When the PPP came out, it was with intention going to go through the private sector banking system, all the SBA lenders. And my personal reaction to that was, thank God. If it all had to go through the SBA disaster group, they would be so completely overwhelmed, money wouldn't flow for a long, long time. So it's got a much broader scope of financial participants in it. I mentioned Colorado microlenders, where their sweet spot to loan money is more in the 10 to 20,000. But if you're a smaller firm, you might get enough money from just the SBA EIDL loan at 3.75%, or the PPP loan. You might not need to go find a bank that's going to give you a big loan. So I would look at the flip side of that. You know, as business people, we've had to go out and hunt and find customers, and it's kind of a numbers game. The more you look at, hopefully the more success you have. This is going to be the financial flip side of that. You're going to look at multiple people, try to find a fit. Not saying it's going to be easy, but there are options that can help. And on our website and other websites, you'll see a link to approved SBA lenders. I think they're all Colorado based, but that's pretty helpful if you want to see some resources. And I will say that I have seen, particularly for some of the bigger national banks, I've heard from multiple clients that they are doing what I'd call some strange things to kind of ensure impartiality and neutrality, how these get looked at. Like, you're a business here in Northern Colorado, but your loan is being looked at by someone in Atlanta, Georgia. So they'll just look at the numbers thing. So that kind of, to me, defeats the purpose of having a banking relationship. But we're hearing a lot of different things about the different ways the banks are handling it individually.
Great. And I think I have covered most of the questions, and we want to honor people's time today. I'm sure if we weren't virtual, you would be hearing a big round of applause for our visitors and speakers. But before we end for today, as I've alluded to in answering a couple of the questions in the chat box, Mike hopes to get us some clarification about whether the SBDC loans may work for some ag enterprises. I gave my best guess at how I think it's unlikely will help with people who have only production level enterprises, but there's a lot of farms doing the gig economy themselves through custom harvesting, or having a meat marketing company, or hosting people through tourism. And if you have a separate LLC for those kind of entrepreneurial enterprises, I think it might be a different answer, but Mike is going to get clarification, which we'll send out to you. In the meantime, our webinar for next week will be on actually what's going on in ag and food markets specifically. We're really hoping by that time the USDA rolls out its programs. It's been a bit slower than the Department of Labor and Small Business Administration in getting that framed. So we're trying to be very careful with it. We are hoping, from what we've heard, this program will be rolling out yet this week even. So by next Wednesday, when we present on ag and food issues, and this is the details for next week, which again, we'll send out to all of you registered, we will actually have the details for those programs as well, but we can't promise because the government gets to do its own thing. So we invite you to join us for that event, and we then hope to also have webinars on how COVID is affecting rural Colorado specifically the week after that, and then the week after that, perhaps tourism. If there are other topics you would like us to cover in the same type of format, please send us your ideas or put them in the chat box. You'll see the chat box also has a number of links shared with you for connection. And even if they are not the right person because you're in a different region of Colorado, they will make sure to connect you with the people who are in your local space and place. And so we will make sure, in addition to sending you a link to this recording, that we maybe also send you a compilation of some of the links that were shared in the chat box today. I want to take this one last chance to thank our speakers, Mike and Jacob, and the REDI team that worked with me on this, Jen, Becky, Stefan, and myself. We appreciate you all coming, and please spread the word if you feel like there's other in your communities or circles that benefit from these discussions the next few days. Anything else from anyone? Okay, have a nice day and stay safe.